Johnny Cash watched Willie Nelson leave mid-show. There was no announcement, no explanation. Willie set his guitar down, nodded once toward the band, and walked toward the side exit as if the decision had already been made somewhere else. The drummer kept the rhythm going for a few seconds, waiting for a cue that never came. When it became clear Willie wasn't coming back, the music unraveled into silence. Cash was sitting in the front row. He hadn't come to perform. He'd driven hours just to listen. Willie had asked him to see what he was trying to build, shows outside the usual circuits, without contracts or radio approval. Just music, Willie had said, for people who actually want to hear it. The place wasn't much, a rough stage, mismatched lights, a crowd packed in close enough to feel each other breathe. But it was full. Students, laborers, families, people who had paid a few dollars to hear songs that didn't fit neatly into the rules Nashville preferred. Willie had been playing for nearly an hour when everything stopped. In the middle of a verse, his voice trailed off. His hand froze on the strings. For a moment, the audience assumed it was part of the song, a pause meant to draw them in. But Willie wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. His attention had shifted toward the back of the room, near the entrance. Something had interrupted the music. Willie stood there, unmoving, long enough for the band to glance at each other. Then he slipped the guitar strap over his shoulder, placed the instrument carefully on its stand, and walked off stage without a word. No one understood yet why it mattered. The audience murmured. Some people laughed nervously. Someone near the bar called out, asking if there was a technical problem. Cash stayed where he was, watching the empty space Willie had left behind. A few moments later, Cash stood and made his way toward the exit. Outside, voices carried across the parking lot. Willie stood a short distance away, speaking calmly to someone who clearly wasn't listening. A small group lingered near the door, tickets still in hand, uncertain whether to leave or wait. A bouncer hovered nearby, avoiding eye contact. Cash didn't interrupt. He watched. The exchange wasn't loud, no shouting, just a disagreement that had hardened into something else. The message was clear enough without being spoken openly. Some people were not welcome, regardless of what they had paid. Willie ended the conversation the same way he'd ended the song, by walking away. Cash remained near the entrance, caught between the noise inside and the quiet outside. Behind him, the crowd grew restless. People wanted refunds. The band was packing up. The night was unraveling quickly. Someone touched Cash's arm. His manager stood beside him, voice low. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Don't get involved. This isn't your fight." Cash looked back toward the parking lot, where Willie was already pulling away.
"It became my fight when I stayed," Cash said. "You've got work lined up," the manager warned. "People watching, support that can disappear." Cash didn't answer. He stepped past him and walked back inside. The room was loud again. Arguments, confusion, disappointment. Cash moved through the crowd until he reached the stage. He climbed up onto it and stood there, alone. He didn't touch the microphone. He didn't reach for a guitar. He just stood. At first, no one noticed. Then a few people turned. The talking slowed. The room began to quiet, not because anyone asked it to, but because something about the stillness demanded attention. Cash waited. 5 seconds. 10. The silence thickened. People shifted uneasily. This wasn't part of the show. There was no script for this moment. Cash's face was calm, unreadable. He wasn't performing. He was letting the absence speak. Someone called out, asking what was happening. Cash didn't respond. When the room finally went completely silent, he spoke, quietly, evenly. Willie Nelson left because people who paid to be here were told they didn't belong. No embellishment, no accusation beyond the fact itself. I came here tonight to listen, to see what he was trying to build. Turns out, some lines still follow you, no matter where you go. A few people looked toward the door. Others stared at the floor. Cash stepped back from the microphone. "I'm leaving," he said, "because staying would mean pretending I didn't see it." He turned and walked off stage. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't argue. They stayed silent, watching him go. Outside, the night had shifted. What had been a parking lot moments earlier was turning into a gathering place. People spilled out of the building in small groups, voices low, questions overlapping. Some were angry, some confused. A few seemed unsettled in a way they couldn't explain yet. Cash crossed the gravel slowly. He wasn't rushing to catch up with Willie. He already knew where he'd be. Willie stood near his van, leaning against the side panel, watching the crowd reorganize itself. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't pacing. He looked like a man who had already accepted the consequences of a decision and was waiting for them to arrive. "You didn't have to come back in there," Willie said when Cash reached him. "I know." For a moment, neither spoke. The noise from the crowd ebbed and flowed behind them. "They'll make this about you," Willie said. "They always do." Cash nodded. "They already have." A few people drifted closer, uncertain whether they were supposed to be there. Someone called out, asking if the show was over. Willie didn't answer right away. He looked past them, toward the dark field beyond the lot. "I didn't leave to make a point," Willie said. "I left because I couldn't stay." "That's usually how it starts," Cash replied. Behind them, Cash's manager appeared again, breath short, eyes sharp. "You've done enough, both of you. Let's go."
"Go where?" Willie asked. "Anywhere that isn't here," the manager snapped. "This doesn't get better the longer you stand around." Cash watched the crowd. People weren't leaving. They were waiting. Not for entertainment, for direction. "You hear that?" Cash asked. The manager shook his head. "I hear trouble." Cash stepped away from them and raised his voice, not loud, but steady. "If anyone still wants to hear music," he said, gesturing toward the open field, "there's space out there." That was all. No promise, no announcement, just an option. The first few people hesitated, then someone moved, then another. Within minutes, the shape of the night changed again. Instruments were carried by hand. A small amplifier appeared from the back of a truck and then disappeared again when it became clear it wasn't needed. Willie watched it unfold, disbelief flickering across his face. "You're serious," he said. "I am," Cash replied. They didn't set up a stage, there wasn't time, and it didn't matter. Willie stood where the ground was flattest and began tuning his guitar by ear. The crowd formed a loose circle, close enough to hear breath and fingers on strings. No one asked for tickets. Willie played first. No introduction, no apology. Just the song he'd stopped earlier, played from the beginning this time. The wind carried his voice unevenly. It didn't need to be perfect. The people listening weren't measuring anything. When he finished, the applause came late, almost cautiously, as if no one wanted to break what had settled over the group. Willie played 2 more songs, then handed the guitar to Cash. Cash didn't rush. He stood for a moment, looking at the people in front of him. Faces lit by truck headlights. People who hadn't expected to be part of anything like this when the night began. "I've sung about standing with people my whole life. Tonight I had to decide whether that's something I only do on stage." No one interrupted. "I stayed seated longer than I should have. That's on me." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Cash played. His voice cut through the open air, rougher than it sounded indoors, stripped of everything except what mattered.
When he finished, he didn't bow or wait for a reaction. He handed the guitar back. The applause came then, full and unguarded. At the edge of the crowd, Cash's manager watched in silence. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. Later, as people began to drift away in small groups, Willie and Cash stood beside the van again. "This will cost you," Willie said. "I know. And you didn't have to follow me." Cash shook his head. "That's not how it works. Not if I want to keep believing what I sing." Willie smiled faintly. "You know they'll remember this differently. Let them. The truth usually survives in pieces."
They shook hands. Not ceremonially, just the way two people do when they understand something has shifted. Neither of them stayed long after that. The field emptied, the night cooled. By morning there would be calls, some angry, some careful, some that never came at all. But for the people who had stood there, listening without a roof overhead, the evening had already settled into memory as something harder to dismiss than a canceled show. It wasn't about who played better. It was about who chose not to stay seated when standing up meant losing something. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in fragments, missed calls, conversations that ended sooner than expected, schedules that shifted without explanation. By the end of the week, Cash's Texas dates were quietly removed from calendars. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence. His label delayed the album rollout, not canceled, just reconsidered. Promotional appearances were postponed. Radio interest cooled in ways that were hard to quantify but easy to feel. Nobody said it was because of Austin. Nobody had to. Willie noticed the difference faster. He wasn't booked less, he was booked differently. College gyms, community halls, union buildings, small outdoor spaces where nobody asked who was allowed inside because the question didn't occur to them. The crowds were younger, more mixed, less predictable. The pay wasn't consistent, but the rooms were full. When people asked why he'd left the venue that night, Willie didn't dramatize it. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He said only that he'd seen something he couldn't ignore, and that once you ignore something like that, you don't get to decide when it stops mattering. Sometimes he mentioned Cash, sometimes he didn't. Johnny Cash didn't bring it up at all. When asked directly, he gave short answers. He said he'd done what he felt he had to do. He said he didn't regret it. He didn't frame it as bravery. He framed it as necessity. That disappointed people who wanted a cleaner story. Inside the industry, the narrative splintered. Some said Cash had overstepped, that he'd confused moral gesture with responsibility to an audience. Others argued he'd protected his image at the expense of pragmatism. A few said nothing at all, which was its own position. What didn't circulate publicly were the private recalculations. Managers reminding clients to be careful. Promoters rethinking conditions quietly. Artists noticing that walking away was possible, even if it wasn't painless. Cash understood that he hadn't changed the system. He hadn't expected to. He'd only interrupted it briefly, enough to expose its shape. Months later, he ran into Willie backstage at a small show in New Mexico. No press, no introductions. Just two men leaning against a wall while someone tuned a guitar nearby. "You still catching heat?" Willie asked. "Less, different kind." Willie smiled. "That means it's stuck."
They didn't talk about the field outside Austin. They didn't need to. The understanding between them had already settled into something quieter and more durable than explanation. Years later, when the night was brought up by a journalist looking for a moral, Cash paused longer than usual. "I stayed seated longer than I should have," he said. "That's the part people don't like to hear." The reporter waited. "I had the bigger name, the safer position. Willie took the first step, knowing he might be alone. That matters." "Do you regret following him?" the reporter asked. Cash shook his head. "I regret almost not following him." That distinction stayed with people who heard it. The story hardened into something like legend over time,
smoothed by repetition. In some versions, Cash led the walkout. In others, the field concert grew larger with each retelling. The details shifted. The center didn't. Two men were presented with the same moment. One recognized it immediately. The other recognized it 30 seconds later. Both paid for it. Neither tried to get the cost refunded. What endured wasn't the interruption of a show or the inconvenience of a venue owner. It was the quiet realization that integrity isn't measured by what someone says when they're applauded, but by what they're willing to lose when applause stops. The audience that night didn't go silent because a performance ended. They went silent because they were forced to witness a choice being made in real time, without slogans, without permission, without certainty that anyone else would follow. That kind of silence lingers. Some of the people who stood in that field later said they didn't remember every song that was played. They remembered the pause before Cash spoke, the weight of waiting, the sense that something had shifted and wouldn't return to its previous shape. They remembered that leaving had been an option, and that staying had been one too. What mattered was who chose which and why.